Well, I was in the Army. I was 20 years of age, and I was pronounced dead from double Hobart pneumonia. They know that I was dead 9.5 minutes because...
Not many people would have believed that a talented young man named George Ritchie, who was expected to become a doctor, would be declared dead after a serious illness. Yet, something extraordinary happened. He came back to life, and his experience would shock everyone. George Ritchie's story became well known after he shared it at a lecture in 1965. By then, he had already become a doctor. At the time of his near-death experience, George was 20 years old and serving in the Army. He had no idea that something as unbelievable as this would happen to him. His story would later inspire many others to think about life after death in a whole new way. Let me take you through George's amazing story. In December of 1943, George Ritchie was stationed in Texas, where he caught a severe case of pneumonia. His condition quickly worsened, and despite doctors' best efforts, he was admitted to the hospital in critical condition. Penicillin had not yet been discovered, so treatments for infections like pneumonia were limited. One day the doctors couldn't feel George's pulse or hear his heartbeat. They checked him again and realized there was no sign of life. They pronounced him dead. The hospital staff prepared to take his body to the morgue, but then something miraculous happened. 8 minutes later, the orderly returned with the gurney to collect the body. He noticed that George's arm had shifted slightly. He wasn't sure what to think, but he called the doctor back to check. After a quick exam, the doctor confirmed that George was indeed still dead, but the orderly didn't give up. He begged the doctor to try injecting adrenaline directly into George's heart. Even though the doctors didn't think it would make a difference, they gave it a try. To their shock, George's pulse suddenly returned. His breathing and blood pressure slowly started to come back. George was alive. George was still very weak and unconscious after being revived. He remained in a coma for 3 more days. But when he finally woke up, he felt a strange sense of peace, even though he didn't understand what had just happened. The medical staff told him that he had been declared dead for 8 minutes, but now he was alive again. At first, George didn't fully believe it. But as he learned more, he realized that something incredible had happened to him during the time he was dead. In fact, George remembered what he had experienced during those 8 minutes. That night, after regaining consciousness, George decided to get up from his hospital bed and find a doctor. He was eager to tell someone about how much better he felt. As he walked through the empty hospital halls, he noticed a nurse coming toward him, carrying a tray of medical instruments. George tried to talk to the nurse, but she didn't seem to notice him. He couldn't understand why. When the nurse passed by, George jumped aside to avoid colliding with her, but she didn't seem to notice. He quickly went back to his room and saw something that shocked him. On his bed was a body covered with a white sheet, and the hand sticking out from under the sheet had a black onyx ring on it. His ring, a gift from his grandfather. George couldn't believe what he was seeing. He was looking at his own lifeless body, but how could that be? He felt completely healthy. He didn't understand how he could be outside of his body, yet still aware of everything happening around him. As George tried to process what was going on, something amazing happened. Without even thinking, he found himself flying above the hospital, moving at an incredible speed. It felt like he was going faster than a plane. He could see everything below him, the streets, buildings, and the world around him. He felt like he was floating above it all, like a bird soaring through the sky. He flew over unfamiliar cities and headed toward his hometown, Richmond. As he approached, he felt like he was flying right over his house. He was amazed by how fast he was traveling, but it also gave him a sense of calm. His mind was telling him this wasn't real, but everything he was experiencing felt so real. Eventually, George stopped flying and noticed a man on the ground below. He thought maybe this person could help him understand what was going on. He floated down closer to the man and tried to ask him for directions, but the man couldn't hear him. No matter how loudly George spoke, the man just kept walking, completely unaware of his presence. George didn't understand it at first. He tried touching the man's shoulder, but his hand passed right through him. The man didn't even notice. George realized that he couldn't connect with the physical world anymore. The man couldn't see him, and neither could the nurse in the hospital. It was as if he didn't exist. As George struggled to understand what was happening, he began to feel an overwhelming sense of isolation. He wanted to be with his family and friends, but no one seemed to be able to hear or see him. He was all alone. Just as George was beginning to lose hope, something extraordinary happened. A brilliant light appeared in the distance. It grew brighter and brighter until it filled the whole room. George felt a wave of love and warmth wash over him. It was the kind of love that he had never experienced before. In front of him stood a glowing figure, radiating light and love. George immediately knew that this was something beyond his understanding. The being of light made George feel safe and peaceful, and he had the sense that everything would be okay. The glowing figure seemed to communicate with George, not through words, but through feelings and thoughts. George didn't understand at first, but then he realized that this being was showing him a panorama of his life. It was as if his whole life was flashing before his eyes, and he could see all the most important moments, the good ones and the bad ones. George saw everything from his birth to his childhood, to the moments that had shaped who he was. He saw his family, his friends, and all the choices he had made in life. The figure of light communicated to him that death was not the end, but just a part of the journey. After experiencing the panorama of his life, George felt himself being lifted higher and higher into the sky. The glowing figure led him to a new place, a completely different world. They traveled through what seemed like space, moving through an area with no boundaries, and eventually arrived at a strange city. This city was not like any place on Earth. The buildings were enormous, and the sky was filled with beautiful light. George could see people here who didn't have physical bodies, but they seemed to be happy and at peace. These people were living in a different dimension, one that was peaceful and full of love. But not everything in this new world was peaceful. George and the glowing figure traveled on, and soon they arrived at a city that George described as hell. This was a place where people seemed unhappy, fighting with each other, full of hatred and anger. Even though these people didn't have physical bodies, George could still sense their emotions. He understood that this city was a place where unhappy souls ended up, and they seemed trapped in a cycle of anger and frustration. As George continued to explore this new world, he saw more of its beauty. He saw a place filled with light, peace, and harmony. He realized that not all souls go to the same place, and the experiences people have after death depend on their lives and choices. Eventually, George was told by the glowing being that it was time for him to return to Earth. At first, George didn't want to go back. He had experienced so much love and peace in this new world that he didn't want to leave. But he knew that he had to go back for a reason. Suddenly, George was back in his body. He could see his own hand again, with the familiar black onyx ring. He was back in his hospital bed, just like before. George spent years trying to make sense of what happened to him. He recovered from his illness and eventually returned to medical school. He went on to become a doctor, but the memory of what he had seen stayed with him. In 1965, George Ritchie shared his story at a lecture where it had a big impact on others. He wanted people to understand that death is not the end. Instead, it is part of a larger journey, and it is up to each person to make the most of their life. George believed that the world could be a better place if people made better choices. He thought that by living with love, compassion, and understanding, humanity could create a paradise on Earth. His story became one of the most well-known near-death experiences, and it helped many people reconsider their ideas about life, death, and what comes after. George Ritchie's journey through life and death taught him, and the world, that life is precious, and that even death is not the end.